assistant here, and we want to welcome you to today's event. Just a bit about us. We are a research institution that specializes in African American history. We have 4 departments here. We have our reference library, which is reference only, so none of the items check out. However, we are a part of the Open Public Library branch. So our materials are available at other libraries where you can check them out as well. But we do have a rare book collection. Our oldest book dates back to the early 1800s. We have books that have been signed by Dr. Martin Luther King. We have a seed library so people can come in and look at and get seeds free of charge, take them home and create their own gardens. Then we have our museum gallery up here, which focuses on African Americans in Oakland. So it's called Visions Towards Tomorrow. We have oral histories that we have here, which are snippets that you'll see that talk about people here in the Oakland area. And as far as those interviews and things, we also have an archives department. So our archives, we have over 160 collections that again document that African American experience. So anything from entrepreneurs to African American first. So we're talking Slim Jenkins, who was part of the West Oakland area, who had nightclubs, liquor store, restaurant, all in this area. Ida Jackson, who was the first African American school teacher in Oakland. We have her collection. Ron Dellums, who was in Congress, Barbara Lee, of course, who represents us now. So those are just some of the handful of collections that we have. As far as the building, finally, this is a building that was built with funds from Andrew Carnegie. So he gave money throughout the country, basically, to build educational institutions such as libraries. So this building was built in 1902, and so upstairs where we are now is where the actual library was at that time. So when the branch, it became a branch library in the 50s, and then it closed in the 70s, but we've had 2 earthquakes here. So we had the one in 1906 and then the one in 89. So the building was sustained minimal damage in the 1906 earthquake, but then in the 89 earthquake, the building was basically destroyed. So $50,000 to build. They had to spend over $11 million in renovations just to get us into the building. So we've been here now for 21, 22 years. So, if you're ever interested, we do tours by appointment during the week. And on Saturdays at noon, we do drop-in tours. So it can be 1 person, 10 people. We give them a whole basic tour and things with the photos and things downstairs and everything. But with that, we have our panelists for today. So we have Hajar Yazdiha, who is the Assistant Professor of Sociology, Faculty Affiliate of the Equity Research Institution, and a 2023 to 2025 CIFAR Global Azarelli Scholar. She has received her PhD for sociology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a former Ford postdoctoral fellow and Turbangian postdoctoral fellow of the chair in civil society and social change. Dr. Yazdiha's research examines these questions by analyzing the mechanisms underlying the politics of inclusion and exclusion. Her work crosses subfields of race and ethnicity, migration, social movements, cultural, and law, using mixed messages, including interview, survey, historical, and computational text analysis. Her new book, entitled The Struggle for People's Kings, How Politics Transforms the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement, examines how a wide range of rivaling social movements across the political spectrum deploy competing and interpretations of the civil rights movement to make claims around national identity and inclusion, comparing how rival movements constituted by minorities and majority groups with a range of identities: racial, gender, sexual morality, religious, moral, and political battle over collective memory. The book documents how the misuses of racial past erode multicultural democracy. Then we have Zach Norris. Zach Norris is an Open Society Foundation Fellow working on a book about the root causes and solutions of family separation. He is a former executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, author of Defund Fear, Safety Without Policing, Prisons and Punishment, and co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that will empower Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice systems. Then we have Bamidele Emerson, who is the chief curator here at the African American Museum and Library. He received his undergraduate and graduate training in cultural anthropology at his alma mater, University of Michigan Ann Arbor. He also has a master's degree in museum studies from Southern University at New Orleans. His fieldwork in Nigeria, Brazil, and Southern United States serves as the focus for his conference presentations, publications, and exhibitions. So with that, I introduce you to our panel, and Bamidele, you can take over.
Yes. We're going to first hear from our speaker, Hajar, and she will give us a focus on the book. And I'm glad to see all of you here. Thank you so very much.
Yes, truly.
And it will be an opportunity, since we're few in number, but an opportunity to do a recording so that we'll be able to share it with our larger audience.
It's a little bit out of focus.
By way of electronic media. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you all for being here. I know it is a sunny Saturday in Oakland, so it means a lot to me. And truly, to my co-panelists, Bamidele, thank you for hosting me here, and Zach for joining us. This is, I'm hoping, going to be a great discussion that we can all engage in, because I think usually you go to a book talk and somebody kind of talks at you. I'm hoping this can be a little different. So I know that there's a lot of knowledge in the room, a lot of experiences we bring to the table, and so I will just kind of lay out a brief overview of the book. So The Struggle for the People's King is a book that comes out of just my observations while I'm in graduate school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I'm looking at the landscape outside, and we see this case of Abigail Fisher, who is a white girl in Texas. She has been rejected from the University of Texas at Austin, and she is trying to take affirmative action to the Supreme Court to repeal it, because she sees this as a case of anti-white racism. So I think what's interesting is, as news continues to come out about this case, we come to find out that she's actually completely mediocre. She's a very basic white student. And yet, the language that's surrounding the case, the language that's going to the highest court in the land, is this language that's pulled directly from Dr. King. And so they are invoking his words, they are using his language to claim that he himself would be opposed to affirmative action. And so starts a project where it's in the midst of kind of this outrage and shock that I come to find, in fact, I think, as we all know, Dr. King's words have been misused for a very long time. And what I came to find after putting the puzzle pieces together, so 40 years of research between 1980 and 2020, just tons of data, is that these misuses of Dr. King's memory are intentional political strategies. And I think the major finding, the kind of takeaway pieces that for me were really ringing the alarm, is that his memory has been misused in the service of rolling back multicultural democracy, rolling back the very things that he and the civil rights movement fought for. So I think that's really where the story begins, and I'm hoping that we can kind of weigh in sort of different spaces where we're bringing expertise at the table to think about what those things might tell us about some of the larger questions that we're grappling with today. We're thinking about devastating wars abroad, we're thinking about these ferocious domestic battles at home, we think about, book bans, public libraries are being shut down, racial education is being banned. And so it's really dire straits. But how can thinking about these misuses of the past, thinking about the resistance, how can that help us kind of scale up and think about what everyday people like us might be able to do? So I'd love to hand it back to you, Pamadela, if you want to jump in with some of your reflections.
Yes, thank you so very much. Oh, well, thank you for that very brief summary of your book, because as I read through parts of it, I highlighted and I had several. I won't raise questions now, but I had several, points of inquiry, and I do think that this is a fascinating book. I read the pre-publication copy, and I had mentioned to you that I had not seen or even conceptualized putting together, nor has anyone pulled together the research that you have on competing uses and abuses of King's memory and the memory of the Civil Rights Movement. And so before I speak, let me just ask, can you pass the microphone to Zach and have him to give a commentary, please?
My main commentary is just thank you so much. This book is just phenomenal. I think that once I read it, I really understood how the struggle for Dr. King's memory is really a struggle for how we understand our country. And there are competing versions of the nation's history. I would put on the far right a sort of nationalist nostalgia that basically says this is a country for white people, and it's a white settler country, and we're proud of that to a certain extent, and that's a reality that's out there. And I think that there's also a collective amnesia that is in somewhere in between, where people are using and misusing Dr. King's legacy, and particularly as I heard from you, like that one line about the content of our character, right? So often people just play that little snippet about Dr. King saying we should be judged based on the content of our character and use that for this kind of colorblind mythology. And I have not read it so clearly laid out, and all of the ways in which from the struggle for LGBTQ rights, the struggle for Muslim folks' rights, like the way in which his legacy has been used and misused in order to divide and conquer us in this country. So I just want to say thank you. I appreciate the work that you're doing through this book, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all about how we can be active agents in really resuscitating that multiracial democracy that you referenced.
The multiracial democracy is something that is something that is so very American, and at the same time, we as a society deny that ourselves the opportunity to fully embrace that. And so I think that this book, The Struggle, and it's called The Struggle for the People's King, is so perceptively accurate. And one of the things we have to think about, books are important to our understanding, but so too is programming in the museum sector. And so here at the African American Museum and Library at Oakland, one of the things that we do is annually on the official birthday for Dr. King, we host the Martin Luther King Film Festival. And so there are different things that are done around the country. Some people hold an annual prayer breakfast. Some organizations have an annual oratory contests for children. Some have lectures and discussions on King. But here we have a film festival so that we can bring the newest documentaries, as well as some of the older documentaries that frame an understanding and appreciation of King and what he did during the course of his life in the struggle for to make sure that we all have civil rights. And one of the things that we did here, we created this little booklet called the Portable Martin Luther King Jr., an activity booklet for children, because we know that everyone knows the quote, "I have a dream." But do children know and appreciate and can understand other quotations from Dr. King? So we created this activity puzzle booklet where we have I hope that you can hear me, but we have a short biographical note on Dr. King, and then we have some of the puzzles, and we have various kinds of puzzles. This is where you have to unscramble the letters, and so we have this quotation, and the letters are scrambled, but it says, "Faith is taking the first step when you can't see the whole staircase." And so the question is, do we have faith? And then we have a word search. So we take one of his quotes from the I Have a Dream speech about he wants to make sure that his 4 children are judged by not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And so you have to find those words. And then we created a puzzle, can you decode the message from Dr. King, in which we have the letters of the alphabet and the numbers 1 through 26, and we pair them, and so that kids can then figure out, learn another quote from Dr. King. And of course we go on and we have a short bibliography in the back, and there are a couple of other puzzles as well. But we have a short bibliography of books for young readers. And so this is important. At this festival, while the adults are upstairs, children are downstairs. And so we have activities for children. From the puzzle book, that's one activity. Songs from the Civil Rights Movement is another, so that's acquainting them with Dr. King's legacy of his struggle. And in addition to that, we even have one other activity where we say, "I have a dream." And then, what do you dream for your community? So that we ask children to look at the society in which they live, the community in which they live, and what would you do? What do you think should be done to make it better, a place for everyone? So I'm pleased to say that this museum thinks of King's legacy as significant, but of course, one day a week is not enough, or one day a year is not enough. And so we have to find ways of engaging our children every day, every time that they walk through walk into the museum and library. We have to do that. So we have books for children, and specifically on civil rights leaders and other notables as well, but certainly those who are engaged in helping to make the dramatic change. And books that even focus on when those persons were quite young, so that we can teach young people that it is okay to be actively involved in changing the society in which they live.
I absolutely love that, and I hope I can take one of those with me. I would love to. So it's so funny because I have 2 young kids, and Zach, I don't know about you. I think you have children as well, right? Oh, they're
11 teenagers.
Tweeted, oh gosh.
11 and
Oh, I'm not ready for that. But it's so interesting because every MLK Day they bring home like their little worksheet, and it's, you know, the little coloring worksheet with Martin Luther King's face, and it'll have the words like love and friendship on it. And that's the extent of the kind of education that they get from a young age, is these sort of conceptions of the civil rights movement as a thing that happened a very long time ago that doesn't really have anything to do with them. And this is exactly what they need. It's something that helps them understand what it has to say about their own lives, and that they, even as very small children, can start developing more of a political and social consciousness that puts them in community with other people, that lets them know that they're not alone in the world and that they have agency. Even as small children that, you know, probably feel like nothing's fair and, you know, my parents always telling me what to do, even they have the capacity to create these small changes. And I think that's really powerful, and I'm grateful for that. I also think, just even thinking about the work that you do at this museum, we live in a time when this museum itself is like a radical act. So I just came from a symposium. It was at the MLK Institute at Stanford, and it was a retrospective on 1963. So it was 1963, we're 60 years on, what can we learn from that time? And I was sitting there with just a bunch of historians who were incredibly smart and telling us all these things about 1963 that I didn't even know, all these ways that it can help us think about today. And for me, I was thinking, especially in the context of this book which is about the making of revisionist history, I was thinking about how 1963 matters today precisely because of a politics that tells us it does not, right? A politics that distorts the past, that erases the past, that makes it illegal to learn about the past. So I think part of it is like having a space like this that preserves the past, but then also, like you were saying with this, right, connects it to the youngest generation is incredibly radical, and I thank you.
I also just want to honor this space and be appreciative to be here in Oakland. I should say that I was born in San Francisco, but I moved to Oakland when I was a week old. I like to say I was a week too late because I love Oakland just that much. It is home. And I think that there's a lot of just kind of liberalism about talking about race that I appreciated that you kind of cut through. And you talked about being a person, I want to quote you correctly, I think you said ethno-racial obscurity or something like that. And so I can relate to that as a light-skinned African-American cisgender man who, you know, my dad's black, my mom's white, and I get, you know, a lot of different people based on the context, you know, telling me I look like, who are you, but who are your parents, you know, really trying to get to my background. And being the former executive director at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Ella Baker would ask, who are your people, right? Like, what lineage do you come from? Like, what brings you, not even agency, what lends authority to what you're saying and what's your background and experience from which you speak. And so I just really appreciated in this book that you talked about kind of your own story and how you come to the work. And then also just, we wove in all of these insightful examples of Dr. King's legacy being used and misused. Because it's not just about the sort of misuses, but also people really reclaiming his legacy, which I think is part of the legacy here in Oakland. There have been some fabulous actions, the Anti-Police Terror Project, who you reference in the book, talking about reclaiming Dr. King's legacy and doing actions in that vein. And I wonder if you will talk a little bit more about history as a series of actively enforced silences. That's one of the things that you wrote, and I thought that was just so powerful. And you have such great examples of the way that looks and how it impacts us today. The enforced silences of the past impacting us today, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you're totally right that the movement to reclaim King really does come out of Oakland. So Yeah, I mean, the history is always a process of erasure. So I think that should be clear, that the process of recording into the history books to create an official record, thinking about who it is that actually receives the authority to do that, always involves a process of power, because by its very nature, you want to make sure you preserve a story that upholds power. And so that's why Orwell has that famous quote that who controls the past controls the future. But I think one of the distinctions I make in the book is that collective memory is not the same thing as history. So collective memory is the way that we collectively make sense of our identity in relationship to the past. So where history is this process where, it's an academic enterprise, it requires multiple sources of evidence, and yet we know, of course, that it leaves a great deal out of the record. Memory is a process that's always incredibly social and political, it's always changing over time, but it's really central to the idea of national identity, this kind of collective story of who we are in relationship to other people. So memory is, for me, the piece in the book where it's very clear that memory becomes completely decoupled, just completely cut off and separated from history. Because if you think about the accurate record, the very fact that, in the last year of his life, 75% of Americans disapproved of Dr. King, they hated the guy, it led to his assassination, they disapproved of him speaking out against the war in Vietnam. If you think about all of that, and then you think about how it's 20 years later that Reagan signs the Dr. King national holiday into law, well, then you think something must have happened, because Reagan is himself, even in that moment in 1983, somebody who hated Dr. King, kind of felt like he had it coming when he was assassinated. He says just as much in kind of different words. And he's also somebody who's opposed civil rights, and he's fought against them. So when he's signing the King holiday into law, it's this moment where he's realizing there's a political advantage because he can use King the way that he wants. He can institutionalize the kind of whitewashed version of his image and of his meanings. And so Reagan decides he's going to tie his legacy to King's, but in a really specific way. So in the book, I show that that's kind of the moment where all of these co-optations really take hold, because you get this national memory where now Dr. King is for everybody. Now this is the story where racism is ended. Reagan says, thanks to Dr. King, he's lifted the great burden of racism from this country. And we're all sitting here like, well, it's not actually over, but okay. But then what's powerful is then all of these right-wing groups can pick up King's memory in the same way Reagan has and start using it against Black and brown people. They can start using it to claim that if you talk about racism, then you're the real racist. They can start saying that racial inequality only exists because you're not working hard enough, and that Dr. King would want you to pull yourself up from your bootstraps. All of these really egregious uses that for anybody who actually knows anything about Dr. King seem bonkers, right? Like, where's this coming from? But at the same time, when you see the sort of misuses traced over time, you realize it becomes the kind of mainstream memory. Most of the American public doesn't know about the radical King. Most of the American public doesn't know that people actually hated Dr. King, and that nonviolence does not mean that you sit by and wait for things to happen. That direct action means disruption. So when we see Dr. King get used against Black Lives Matter, for example, they say, oh, Dr. King would disapprove of you shutting down highways and creating all this chaos. What did they think the civil rights movement was, right? So yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's one of the ones that we should really keep thinking about when we think about how to take this on, because it is a really deep political project, it is entrenched in a lot of power, and so resisting the false narrative isn't really quite as easy just saying, oh, that's actually not true.
Oh, thank you so very much. And I would state that it's important that we recognize, as you said, the reclaiming of King's legacy. But also, I would say the extending of King's legacy, as you have done in this book as well. I was intrigued by one quotation from you, and I highlighted it here. I demonstrate that movements from the far right have grown branches of civil rights memory that weaponize memory against itself, targeting and discrediting movements for racial and social justice. I mean, you've alluded to a little bit of this just a second ago, but can you talk about this weaponizing uh, uh, weaponizing this memory against itself.
Yeah, I'm glad you drew out that quote because I think it's central to the project of erasing the past in order to claim and sediment power and to bring the masses along with you. So weaponizing the past against itself ends up looking like what Zach described a little bit, which is the creation of this culture of ignorance. And so this is what the Black philosopher Charles W. Mills calls an epistemology of ignorance. And it's the idea that when you erase the past, when you make it impossible for people to actually know their own history, then for those in power, it's much easier to claim a kind of willful unknowing. They only don't understand the past because they choose not to, because it challenges their conception of who they are, it challenges their conception of the truth, and so then it becomes much easier to kind of get your hooks on a much rosier kind of vision of colorblindness, of racism that ended, of a Dr. King who just believed in kind of holding hands and loving each other, and that was really the way forward. So I think the weaponization piece is both a symbolic story about how the symbol of Dr. King gets used against the very things he fought for, but then it's also a material story because it's a story where it's actually creating these spaces where inequality gets deeper and deeper. It's so deeply entrenched that you can't even challenge it the way that you used to, because most of the population doesn't actually even really believe it exists. So it's, you know, when we think about a culture of ignorance, people hear ignorance and they kind of get up in arms because they think I'm saying they're stupid. And in this sense, ignorance doesn't mean uneducated. It means a kind of willful unknowing. And so when you think about people who put their head in the sand and they just don't want to know what's going on, and I don't know if we all do. I certainly have a friend or two who like to say that they just don't do politics, right? They're just apolitical, as if politics doesn't shape, you know, the air they breathe. And so anyway, so this is all to say that I think it's important to remember that we're not concerned only because this is some like kind of false version of the past. We're concerned because it has these significant stakes in our day-to-day lives.
Thank you so very much. When I read that quote about weaponizing memory, and just hearing you speak about erasing the past, but we also erase King, and we erase facets of the civil rights movement. And so, as a curator, I've had the opportunity when I worked in another museum to receive an exhibition from the Smithsonian Institution, traveling services. And it was an exhibition on images of King created by artists across the country. I think there were about 200 or 300 images in it. It was a big exhibition. And so I said, oh, this is an opportunity for us to really develop some dynamic programming around it. But I was in Michigan at the time at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, which at that time was the largest black museum anywhere on planet Earth. And the one that was built on the mall that opened just a few years ago is a gargantuan museum, and I'm certainly glad to see it. But I thought about the works of artists and their struggles around reclaiming King, not erasing King and his image and what King did. And so there is a Michigan artist, the late John Onye Lockhart from Detroit, and he created an image of different scenes or different vignettes from King's life. And he painted that, and this was shortly, it was in the aftermath, a few weeks after King's death or King's assassination. He completed the piece, he had framed it, and he was disturbed. And he took the piece out of the frame. And he had a bucket of rusty nails sitting in his garage. and he put nails all around the frame. And so it was a bristling, which became part of the work of art. But the work of art bristled. It contained King's memory. And I said, okay, well, why did you do that? And so I'm going to ask you, I know that you have not seen the image, but if you can imagine a collage of different vignettes of King's life, and it's in a frame, and then there are nails all around it, what would be your first, why do you think that the artist would have done that? Yes, sir.
To really get everyone's attention.
Yeah, yes, he did get people's attention with that.
He nailed it.
Anybody else? Well, for some people, they had an immediate reaction to King as a Christian minister. And it's the nails in relation to the crucifixion of King, to the crucifixion of Christ. In this case, King was crucified. But then John was a very thought-provoking visual artist. And as we talked, and as I learned more about him, I know that John was interested in reclaiming King in relation to the continent of Africa. So in one of his images, and he's painted several images of King. One, he has King wearing kente cloth, a kente cloth stole around his neck. And that is a way of reclaiming King and introducing us to the fact that King was in Ghana at the time that Ghana became independent, and that the Union Jack was lowered and the flag of Ghana was raised. And so most people don't understand or appreciate King in relation to that element of history. Then there's but it does not stop there. In his library, he had an extensive collection of African books on African art. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term Intisi in Conde. In the Congo, it's a term that's used for power figures. They're ritual images. But whenever you make a promise, or two people make a promise, they have made a contract. And so you go and you go to the Nganga of a priest, and each of you will put some of your saliva on a blade that is then nailed into the ritual figure. And whoever breaks their promise or breaks the contract, or doesn't hold on to the contract, then that figure is known as the hunter, and it is his duty to track down that person, tell them how they did not uphold the contract, and then exact the appropriate punishment on them. When I looked at that work, I couldn't help but think of this quotation, and it's quoted in part in the 1776 report that you quote. I have not read that. This was a quote that Donald Trump issued in response in part to the 1619 project. But he quotes this in part of it. And so here's a complete quote that's important. America, and this is from the March on Washington, America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, which has come back marked insufficient funds. So the promissory note has not been fulfilled. And in many respects, what John was saying was reclaiming the Africanity of King, but transforming his image into an Nkonde Nkisi figure to say that, you must answer for your justice. And so, again, this erasure of the past, erasure of King, erasure of the civil rights movement, and the weaponizing that takes place. This is one way in which visual artists have responded to this image.
No, thank you for that. That's so powerful. It's interesting too, because the question of erasure, one that comes up in the book, is also the question of the erasure of women, especially Black women, queer folk. And so what does it mean that they've been left strategically out of the record of the civil rights movement when they were responsible for so much of the organizing work, its gains, even just propping up Dr. King and allowing him to do his thing. And so, Zach, I was thinking about your work with the Ella Baker Center. And, she's one of the major figures who was really written out, and I think more recently has been written back in and also connected to a much longer lineage of Black women's activism, grassroots activism. I'm wondering how you see that work playing out for you, both as a writer who has written a lot of this grassroots work into recognition and into being, but then also somebody who was directing a center in her legacy, somebody who is an organizer in his own right. What does that look like for you?
Thanks for that question. And I think that part of the reason why folks named the Ella Baker Center after Ella Baker was really to lift up her legacy and her work across generations, to focus on young women's leadership, young men's leadership. And she didn't suffer fools lightly. She would take Dr. King to task, take any person within the movement to task. And I think it's just important because what you talk about in this book is the way in which Dr. King's legacy is being tied to a particular vision of Christianity and to a family values frame that is patriarchal in nature and is a revisionist history, I would say, of Christianity as well. And so, Bamidele, to your point about this artist who was sort of tacking up these nails around the image of King, that's also, for me, a reclamation of who Christ was. And what I see happening with fascists is if you look at their vision of Christianity, it's a very militarized, they have almost a Rambo vision of Jesus Christ, which is really contrary to what he was. It's this sort of vengeful God and militaristic God. And so I think that there's an aspect of what he was calling for as a person who believed in nonviolence, as, and all of us have our struggles, and he certainly had those, and Ella Baker brought some of those to task, as I've mentioned. But I think that we have an opportunity, and what I appreciated about your book is that you really help name some of these intersections. When I was thinking about when you describe the history as being a series of actively enforced silences, you also talk about Anita Hill. And Anita Hill is a figure who, last century was talking about Me Too issues and moments, and you really described how if we had listened to Anita Hill, maybe we would have been at a different point by the time all of this Me Too moment occurred, that Tarana Burke and others really helped to name. So I know that's a little bit jumping around, because I think what's so powerful about this book is you go from different vantage points to really name these misuses. And I just have to tell one quick story. Is I'm reading your book, I'm reading about how in the Muslim community, pre-9/11, as you describe it, like there's this sort of model minority contingent of folks who are really trying to say, we don't actually need the civil rights movement almost effectively, right? And then 9/11 happens and people have kind of an aha moment like, well, actually, maybe we do need to understand Dr. King's legacy as it relates to the Muslim community. And what I appreciated about your book is that you name that there's this division among Muslim immigrants and Black Muslims who have a long history in the country. And through some solidarity building and some consciousness raising, both Black Muslims and Muslim immigrants start to sort of come together. And as I'm reading that history, and then you pivot to talking about Linda Sarsour, who's like a dear friend, and her quotes are just so powerful that I'm like crying as I read your book, and I'm pumping my fist at the same time. I'm just like, yes, like solidarity being built is being built, you know, among Muslim immigrants, among Black Muslims, among Black Muslim immigrants, also like people coming together to really claim Dr. King's legacy in this vision of beloved community, right? And that to me is like the most powerful aspect of one of the most powerful aspects of Dr. King's legacy is this vision of beloved community. And I feel like folks are getting it so twisted when they misuse his legacy in ways that are designed to disrupt that beloved community. So thank you for making that so clear and so plain. And I'm looking forward to like, you know, the graphic novel version and the cartoon version and the way to really continue to popularize these false divisions that shouldn't be. So thank you.
Wow. Zach, thank you. And please tell Linda I appreciate her very much. I don't have the honor of knowing her. Oh man, yeah, so I think for me, coming to this book, I'm glad you read because it really is the one that's most personal for me as, you know, a non-white, non-Black immigrant. I am the daughter of Iranian political refugees. I grew up in this country, but I was born in Germany. And, you know, I grew up in predominantly white communities. It was always kind of the model of being a non-white immigrant in this country is that you look for the quote-unquote best neighborhoods, the quote-unquote best schools, and of course, as we know, because of the way resources and power are distributed, they most often happen to be very white. And so it's like this growing recognition over time, especially being raised by parents who are very politically conscious. You know, we're 5 years old at the dinner table talking about Marx, and you know, like that kind of class consciousness is built in early. But the anti-Blackness of immigrant communities didn't really become apparent to me until I got a little bit older and started reading some of these histories of Black thought. So it really was the great thinkers, you know, like Baldwin and Du Bois, and eventually I would come to Dr. King. And just sitting with these histories and these analytic lenses and realizing that this does have something to do with me. So just because I am neither Black nor white, just because I'm outside that kind of hierarchy, I actually, it turns out, am part of it and I'm complicit in it because of the story of immigrants in this country, which is a story where you try to get as close as you can to whiteness because whiteness grants you your full humanity. And I think it's in recognizing that and really sitting with the discomfort of it that it all started to kind of become clear to me that it wasn't just my personal experience. This is really the experience of many immigrant communities, and grappling with what it means to, you know, want very much to be recognized as fully human, to be working so hard to kind of, you know, get the tools, the resources, the status, the respect, just the daily respect, and realizing that, as I show in that chapter, you're going to continue to bump up against these boundaries because whiteness does not yield. So whiteness is going to hold on to itself as much as it can. It's going to try to promise you that if you come with us, we'll let you sit over there at that table, but you will never sit with us. And I think for a lot of immigrant communities, it's chasing that aspirational whiteness that's been part of the project of anti-Blackness that perpetuates so much of this division. So what I like about that chapter, what I like about the story, is that it's one where these Muslim immigrants and their children kind of come around to realizing that the way that they're experiencing the post 9/11 world, the way they're being lumped and homogenized, even though they have completely different histories, they come from different backgrounds, is one that is rooted in the project of racialization, it's the project of anti-Blackness in this country. And so to be surveilled, to have, FBI come and pretend to be Muslim and sit inside your mosques and your Muslim student associations, that is part of the same carceral project that means Black people get racially profiled, that they're much more likely to get gunned down by police. And so realizing those linked fates, that kind of Dr. King idea of that inescapable network of mutuality, that is the foundation of coalition building and like true solidarity politics.
Thank you so very much, because I was just going to ask you to focus on the Muslim section in your book. This is an interesting book, a very interesting book, and I just want to let you know that one of the chapters is titled, Dr. King Would Be Outraged. LGBT and family values activists contest over the moral boundaries of memory. And there is another, this is the beginning of us taking back America. And so the immigrant, how do we deal with immigrants and those people who are the nativists, those who were born and raised here? But even if you're born and raised here, in anthropology, we're taught that we're all Creoles because we are, once your parents come here and, the next generation, we are all members of this society. We grow up with some things that are in common. And then Muslims are the new blacks. And then Me Too, Black feminism, and the Queenmakers. And so what I'm struck by is this, when I stated earlier, it's not only the reclaiming, but the extending of an understanding of the civil rights movement, and an extending an understanding of Dr. King's legacy. When I read this quotation from your book, although most minority rights movements deploy the memory of the civil rights movement to demonstrate that they are analogous to Black Americans and make claims to civil rights, the immigrant Muslim rights movement delayed their use of civil rights memory for 3 decades. And when I read that quote, I couldn't help but think that when I was at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, where I used to be the executive director, we showed a film called A Class Apart, which dealt with the stories in the 1950s of Mexican Americans in Texas who were not embracing the use of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution because they did not want to be identified or racialized as akin to blacks. And so I think this, the anti-blackness is so important, and at the same time, it is so debilitating. Can you just comment further on that?
Yeah, it is debilitating. And because I think it's also hard to see another way. For those who particularly have not learned the sort of history of Black struggle, the histories of Indigenous people's resistance, the stories of coming up from underneath and actually creating change that looks something completely different from what you would have imagined. So I think part of that is the assimilationist story. And this is kind of one of the ways that Dr. King initially comes to the table, I think, is this idea of integration. The idea that, we're just gonna fight for our rights and we're gonna get folded into the system. What I like about following Dr. King's trajectory is I think it's one that actually models a lot of people's when they start to come into political activism, which is one that may initially think that small reforms are really all you need, that you can kind of work with the system you have, and you can fold yourself in, you can make small tweaks, you can be more inclusive as the sort of popular language goes. I think when you realize how rigid those systems of white supremacy are, that they truly will not give, not even an inch, not a millimeter. That's, I think, when some of the vision comes in. That's, I think, where some of the greater creativity comes in, where you realize that the change is not just about making your way into the system. The change is about tearing it apart and starting from the beginning, right? You know, the Angela Davis words of tearing it up from its roots. So I think that's part of the thinking around this question of, you know, the kind of unyielding boundaries of American identity, the shifting ideas about what belonging means, is that it's not just of getting folded into a white dominant society, it's of changing the standards to begin with, changing what we mean by inclusion, right? Included by whom? Like, maybe I don't want to be included by those people. So I think, for me, that's actually the question we should really be asking, because I know a lot of really well-intentioned people that really do take this kind of reformist perspective. And maybe one of the open questions, like something we could talk about, is can you have both? Because it is something I think about a lot. Some people like to put, you know, King and Malcolm X sort of like on opposite sides of that spectrum, where one was sort of like a separatist project, we're not even gonna bother. One was a little bit more like we can, you know, work in increments and sort of make small changes. I think so long, my own perspective is, so long as they're not opposed, if they're not undercutting one another's efforts, which is unfortunately what I see too much among the left today. But if they're not, then to me actually could be valuable. But I would be interested to hear what the perspective is from the, you know, the organizer on this panel.
Well, thank you for that, and just the analogy that comes to mind for me is this sort of musical chairs of oppression, that like blackness is associated with not having a chair, and so we're all going around, we're trying to find a chair, and people are not trying to identify with being black, but then also there's the musical chairs of oppression means that different identities can be the folks who are left out. So sometimes immigrant folks are left out. And what I appreciate about what you're naming is we need to actually end that game. Like, we need to stop being pitted against one another and actually build something entirely new. And I also appreciate about what you just said is like the difference between Dr. King and Malcolm X is not as distinct as people make it. It's like, if you're talking about ending militarism inside the United States as Dr. King was, like, that is actually ending the United States. Like, that is the project of the United States is US empire. And so I just feel like, look, I've been doing work for 20 years as an organizer, and so you do actually need things that are reforms. Like, you need to be able to materially address people's conditions, and you also need to be able to like point out the game and how people are being abused. And one example from my partner's work just yesterday, she was in Maryland, and they're organizing for one fair wage, which means basically to have a minimum wage with tips on top, right? And so the federal minimum wage for tip workers is actually $2.13 an hour, right? And so 7 states have the minimum wage be the same, and California is one of those states, so it's a one fair wage state. But many states, there's a sub-minimum wage for tip workers. So anyhow, they're in Maryland, they're fighting a $3.64 an hour wage in Maryland, and they're trying to raise the wage so that it'd be at the level of the standard Maryland minimum wage. And a group of restaurants closed their restaurants, brought their predominantly black staff to the hearing, and had folks basically say, we don't want the raise to be waged, the wage to be raised, because it'll mean that our tips are taken away. And they had folks get up and say, like, you know, I make $3.64 an hour, but if the wage wasn't so low, I might not be able to get a job. You know, I'm formerly incarcerated, or the different rationales and reasons. And so all this to say, like, the mythologies that you point out in the book, the mythology of black satisfaction, the mythology that black people rebel and revolt as a result of outside agitators coming in. And that was a big part of the messaging that they brought in terms of attacking the One Fair Wage group, because it was predominantly immigrant folks who were calling for one fair wage. Now, those immigrants were both black and Latinx, but they were seen as sort of like, y'all don't know. And I guess it's indicative for me of just like the complexity that you name in this book of really how do we get to that beloved community. And so I guess to come to the end of what I'm saying, I think we both need to be pushing for, you know, an actual minimum wage, a fair wage, and at the same time be calling out, hey, these restaurant owners are playing us off of each other, and how do we actually continue to push for a broader analysis. And I want to close this story with a positive example, which is to say, in Chicago, they just recently passed one fair wage. And it's a predominantly black city council, new black mayor, really down folks. They passed one fair wage. They're asking the Chicago mayor, after they pass one fair wage in Chicago, what do you think about the fact that your predominantly black constituents aren't happy with your immigration policy? Because all of these folks from Texas and Florida are busing people immigrants up to Chicago, right? And so he's a black mayor, progressive, and they're like, you know, most black constituents don't support your policy. And he said, well, most folks, he basically brought it back to U.S. foreign policy and talked about the blockades and sanctions in Venezuela. He talked about how many Afro-Venezuelans and how many Afro-Colombians are coming up from Latin America, and really flipped the script in terms of how they were framing the question to draw out this kind of beloved community. And I just thought, man, I had never heard a mayor doing that. If y'all don't know about the mayor of Chicago, I feel like folks should support him because he is going to get attacked, having that level of like political acumen and savvy to be able to kind of deflect that divide and conquer. So that to me is like the gold star example, like do the positive policy, but also be able to reflect that larger dynamic that Dr. King was evoking in terms of his politics.
Yes. Oh, I love that story. Okay, I'm gonna look up this mayor. I just want to point out really quickly, in the question of like the living wage, when we think about the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, the part that gets left out, jobs and freedom, they were demanding a $2 minimum wage. That was 1963. And so when you put that in the inflation calculator, that means a $20 living wage today. And so that really tells you like $3 in 2023, like that's unconscionable. I don't know if
Okay. Yes, I was about to just do that. If you have any questions or comments, we have one microphone, so we'll have to pretend like I'm Phil Donahue. No questions?
Well, I have one comment, that my background is in chemistry and engineering.
Okay.
My background is in chemistry and engineering. I'm a very simple guy. I have to use my hands and feet and pull down my pants and count to 21. And it brought a lot of topics. I thought I was going to be focusing only on Martin Luther King, but you put out a lot of topics out there. So what it does is that you lose the compass for action. You got all these topics, you need to focus on one thing. Okay, again, as back in chemistry, we have to take into account the finiteness. I usually say that questions of morality depends, usually because of finiteness. We don't have finite time. We don't have infinite sources. We have infinite time. So therefore, morality issue of morality comes into play because of the finiteness of our time. Talking about history, okay? Talking about chronicle, you get a lot of documentation, tons and tons of documentation. Nobody can absolutely read every single piece of paper, every single document, so forth. What history do is, so you have chronicles and documents, and then you have history. History makes interpretation of the chronicles. So often in the chronicles, someone might write, the glass is 2/3 empty, but the audience, they hear 1/3 full. So you have the same set of facts, two different perspectives, two different lines of action. So this is where, when you're talking about, I'm not sure about destruction of memory, but to give you an example of what happened in San Francisco a few years back, when you had the old San Francisco main library, and when they transferred, the books, the documents to the new San Francisco, I actually saw, in the back of the old San Francisco, you had these dumpsters full of books and magazines thrown away. And in fact, there's one periodical that I used to go and check was no longer there because it was thrown out to the dumpster. So that kind of stuff bothers me a lot. I'm glad to hear that Google's trying to interact as much of the documentation they can from paper form to electronics. Again with when you're talking about you're talking about Martin Luther King and the interpretation of his thoughts or his contribution, it kind of reminds me of a story back in the year 2000, prehistoric times. Some guy, I was looking for a teaching position, he was asked to interpret a poem of Santayana. He gave his interpretation and they said, no, that was the wrong interpretation. So the guy said, well, I'm going to talk to the author, Santayana himself, who was at University of Chicago. And so he asked him, what is your interpretation of this poem that you wrote? And he said, man, this has been so long time ago. My poem is a gift to the world. Whatever interpretation you come up with, that's fine by him. So often, when we're trying to say, okay, what would Martin Luther King would think about this or that, I think it's kind of a pointless exercise. Because it could be just like what Santayana said, well, I made this speech a long time ago. How you want to interpret, it's fine by me. So it's one of those things.
Thank you for your question and commentary. Your commentary. I will ask the writer to respond.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something that I think about a lot because you're right, especially when somebody lives to inspire other people, when, they write words that can work in all kinds of different ways, which I think we talked about, they do, right? They've been used by all kinds of different people. Then there's that open question of does it actually matter, or could we even really know? But my answer would be, one, yes, I think we could know because thankfully this man wrote a lot and he spoke a lot and his written words do give us a very clear sense of what he did and did not believe. You're right, there are certain things we'll never know, especially when it comes to things that didn't exist in his day. We'll never know how he felt about social media, for example. But I think the other piece is the question of the stakes. So to what extent does it matter that we know what he truly believed? And in this case, when you see that he's been used in the service of power, he's been used in the service of division, in the service of violence, in the service of gaslighting, just a racial gaslighting that makes a lot of people feel crazy because they are denying a kind of reality that exists, then you realize the stakes are really high. So I think part of it is the question of, when you think about a poet, for example, maybe the stakes are a little lower if he gets misinterpreted. When you think about a figure that gets used in national politics, that gets used to justify overturning civil rights laws, then I think it really does matter that we go back to the original record and see what he said.
So Jamie Foxx plays this personal injury attorney. He's a real person with Willie Gary, and they are defrauding black folks from their funds basically to pay for their own family members' burials. So he's going after this person, and he's meeting with someone, and they're in this field in southern Mississippi. And the guy is saying to him, like, everywhere you look in Mississippi is where our ancestors are, right? Like, black folks who were enslaved were not given proper burials, did not have headstones often. And so he's saying that this evil company is sort of redoing that trauma. But he also mentions how, you know, a lot of the spaces where you find Confederate monuments and statues are also open spaces which are put on top of these burial grounds for Black and I would say indigenous folks as well. So what it reminded me of is what you point out in the book is just this struggle for our collective memory, right? And to me, what it also named was that genocide is a two-part process. Genocide is a process of like eliminating people, but it's also a process of superimposing the dominant group's culture, philosophy, ideology on top of people who have been oppressed. And in this case, it's sort of like a literal physical example of like those Confederate monuments being placed on top of what should be kind of sacred burial spaces. And I guess I just thought of it because the question I have for you is like, so much of what the right is doing is to me like a kind of bald-faced lie. It's like, it's not a genuine attempt to, you know Dr. King or like claim his legacy. And so, you know, and I was just listening to a conversation between my partner and one of her coworkers, and they were kind of like, how do we respond when they're just lying, you know? And so that's kind of my question to you is like, you're reading all of this collective revisionist history, how much do we respond on their terms? Like, what's your take on, what's your take on that?
Yeah. Want me to lay this here? No. Yeah, let's just keep talking. So we should talk about this because this is like one of the questions that keeps me up at night is how you counter a right wing that's so powerful, whose power is so deeply entrenched, and who also controls the media narrative. So that's the piece that really came through in the book is that it's not like Black communities are not responding to all of these completely false uses of history. Like at every single turn, with every false invocation, there are Black civil rights activists, Dr. King's own family members, the official King Center, grassroots activists, historians, all of them are speaking up and saying, that's not what King said, that is not what he meant. He would be so firmly opposed to all of these misuses. And yet, it doesn't make it into the mainstream media, the mainstream narrative, because media is committed to clickbait, they are committed to profits, and so they're going to represent the most salacious and sensationalist representations, which come from the right, because the right is very good at being salacious. So, you know, for me, it's like, when I think about the fact that that resistance has been there all along, and yet it hasn't been enough, that tells me that it's not enough to respond, and that responding, if anything, can legitimize what they're doing. So I'm not sure about this, but my take from a lot of the cases in the book is that the most successful strategies are the ones that bypass the right altogether and that focus on mobilizing all the other folks in the middle. So those who can actually be swayed, those who are more receptive, and then of course, those on the ground, in the trenches, who have been divided and conquered. So trying to break those boundaries down is far easier than trying to go after a right that is committed to just kind of saying the same things over and over again ad nauseum, and then also when you respond to them making themselves into the victim. So
yeah, that's really interesting because that aligns with the organizing strategy, which is like build your base, move the middle, and isolate the right. Like
Yes. So you knew all along.
No, I did. I mean, I knew it in the context of political mobilization, but I hadn't thought about it in the context that
So
Yeah.
resonates.
And I'm curious, yes,
There's no way to keep people from having different interpretations of things. And there's no way to keep people from misusing things. And I'm really thinking about the dangers like of AI and the applications of technology to do things like that. Now, in your study, have you come across, perhaps for your Iranian background?
yes.
I'm sure that something like this has happened in Iran. And so what have been the successful strategies? I would think that encouraging personal stories within families and emphasizing the need of people to tell personal stories so that you will end up with activists, for instance, what the Armenians are doing with the Turkish revisionist story and stuff. So how can we do that? I mean, what in your study has emerged as successful ways to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, thank you. And you're totally right about the dangers of AI. You can even think about some of the more ridiculous images we've seen. For example, I don't know if you all saw the image after affirmative action was repealed, there was this, of course it was false, but it was this image of Dr. King walking alongside President Trump. And they were sort of like walking off into the sunset as if King's dream had been realized because affirmative action was repealed. And I mean, in my circles, it was like this hilarious meme, but it was shared without any irony. It was shared as this kind of story of, look at this kind of equivalence between these two national heroes, and now their goals have been mutually realized. So it's pretty sickening. But to get to your deeper question, I think the question of what we do, the question of family stories, of community stories, that's actually really central to part of what I see as the way out. One of the things that comes across in the book, these 3 separate chapters that take on kind of different social movements that are using King's memory, is that the most powerful forms of solidarity building and repair come through these internal reckonings that come from looking at each of these groups' histories and then reckoning with those. And so it doesn't have to mean taking on like this grand national narrative, which frankly most of us don't have really any control over. But what it does mean is thinking about, so for example, with the LGBTQ movement, they have to do this kind of internal reckoning to grapple with the fact that their figureheads have been white men, that they have selectively excluded Black people from their organizing, and that by doing so, all they're doing is reproducing a system of power. So if you think about the fact that they, in like the 90s, they're saying that gay is the new Black, as if Black people couldn't be gay. We see the same thing happen with the immigrant rights movement. So the immigrant rights movement is doing their mobilizing, and they're not grappling with the fact that they're excluding Black people. By saying immigrant rights or civil rights, they're not thinking about what it means for Black communities, even Black immigrants. And it's the same thing that happens with the Muslim rights movement, is not recognizing that Muslim history in the United States is a Black history. It's the history of Black Muslims, it goes back to the enslaved peoples. So for me, the story of the internal reckonings doesn't have to be on a grand scale. It could look like reckoning with what's the history of Oakland, right? What's the history of your neighborhood? Like, what does it look like to live in the place that you live? The stories that shape your family, your community, and then thinking a little bit more about how truth can bring that reconciliation to the fore. That's, for me, kind of one of the next steps, is thinking about how does truth and reconciliation, these questions of repair and moving forward, how does that look in the US context? Because we've seen it a lot, like in the South African context of Rwandan genocide. What does that look like on a community level? So, I mean, I think the storytelling piece you bring up is really critical, because that is the piece that connects all of these larger ideas to the individual kind of meaningful stories that I think root us in shared humanity.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank goodness for the African American Museum and Library.
Can you hold it to you?
Yeah, Thank goodness for the African American Museum and Library here at Oakland. I'll try to be short. I probably should have been on the panel myself. But I know that, I think it was Barry Rustin who said that freedom is never a final act. And Oscar Wright, who spoke right in this auditorium here, he had worked in the Oakland school system for years, trying to get parity for the blacks in the Oakland school system here in the Flatlands. And in his 90s, he stood here and said that the situation was hopeless. The genocide was being practiced right here in Oakland in the school systems, was his phraseology. I went to UC Berkeley. I had a professor there, Harry Edwards. He was the architect of the Black Olympic boycott in Mexico City, 1968, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith held up the Black Power symbol. Harry Edwards said at Berkeley that if blacks were to begin to use the libraries, the public libraries, like other groups do, the Asians or whatever, that they would change the rules to going into the libraries. And then I think, finally, I think it was Malcolm X who said, you'll never live in anything but a black community. So I'm wondering from the panel, if there's any progress that's been made, or can we truly make any progress? If you look at the great leaders that have appeared, whether it was Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Huey Newton, whoever, somehow or another they get taken out. And it seems like that, okay, they're taken out by some arbitrary, random killer. But is it the powers that be? Is this something coming down from the top? It's John F. Kennedy, or whatever. So is there really any hope? Can anything really be done to change this? And do you think it's a conspiracy coming from the powers that be? Thank you.
Okay. It's definitely a conspiracy. This is an easy answer. That I feel like, white nationalism and racism and sexism, patriarchy are conspiratorial endeavors in the sense that many people contribute to them and they try to get other folks bought into those same ideologies. And so we had a chance to talk outside, and I would say that, if you look at the evidence in terms of COINTELPRO, there were clear indications that political leaders were directly targeted, like Fred Hampton. So there's that level of conspiracy that is direct violence, and then there's the more loose conspiracy of getting people to buy into an ideology where they might assassinate the Dr. King even if they aren't directly themselves associated with the US government. So I think the short answer is that yes, there is this kind of conspiracy. It may not be always like, 3 people in a room directing the action. And I do think that there is hope. I think that there is hope because, at least in my lifetime, there has never been, to me, as clear a division being drawn between a future of a multiracial, radically inclusive democracy and white nationalism. And, that's the terrain we're on in the context of climate change, in the context of, potential ecological collapse. I'm not saying that the hope is not fraught with a lot of danger all around us, but I do think that the stakes are very clear for people who are paying attention, and for those who are not, we have to really, I wouldn't even say call attention because people know. I think we just have to help folks find that space of hope collectively. And that's why I appreciate this book, is because it's like, we're not gonna just, and why I appreciate folks in Oakland so deeply, we're not just gonna let Dr. King's legacy be this sanitized version that they want it to be. We're gonna have agency, and we're gonna be out in the streets and reclaiming collective memory. I'm hopeful that part of the reason we don't have as many people here is because a lot of people went to the rally in San Francisco to support the folks in Gaza, and I, feel like that's another example of enforced silence that we should, as people of good conscience, name and talk about. So.
We are going to close in just a moment so that we can have, so that you can have time to share your book, and so that someone wanted to buy it, they can do so. This book will be available at Marcus Bookstore. I did call. I did call Marcus Bookstore, and they said that they're out of it right now, but they have some that will be ordered, and it should be in the next week. And so I wanted to also let you know that I did speak with the fire person that came here, and he said that, we don't have a fire, obviously, because we're sitting here. But also, there's, we have to check that dust might be in our line, and it's causing the fire alarm to go off. So I just want to reassure all of you of that.
They don't want us to know, Dr. True legacy.
Well, that's the conspiracy. Okay, we'll have one more question, and then I will ask you to have final comments.
Does the author have anything to say about my comment?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I could also end with this.
oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to end with a comment because I think it speaks to your question, the question of hope. And first of all, yes, I don't even think it's a conspiracy. I think it's sort of common record at this point that these folks have been taken out by the government and the folks that they deputized. So you're absolutely right. I think part of the story is the story of government repression, of significant surveillance. It is the story where you manipulate, you infiltrate, you wedge, you do everything you can to kind of cut it off at its roots. But I think that's the story of the people, right? Is persistence in spite of. So the hope for me comes from a lot of the stories of the young activists that are coming up, and they are rejecting the old methods, they are rejecting all of the ideologies they've been given. They are realizing that we have dealt them a really bad hand, and they're gonna think outside that box. They're going to think bigger. They're drawing on the Afrofuturist vision, the Afrofuturist legacy. Like I saw you had something about Afrofuture, it's like an exhibit or?
We are going to have programming around that.
Excellent.
That's forthcoming.
That's excellent.
So we have, in our new version of this exhibition, when we move this to one side, we have Afrofuturist visions of some of the historic people and how they would appear. This gets to the AI, but nevertheless, how do we update and envision our stories, and how do we envision ourselves as part of the future, and not being capped with expressing the idea of having a future. So that is part of the vision of the new, in part of the vision of the new core exhibition. So please come back in about a year's time, and you will see a rearrangement here.
Yes, I mean, so that's really it, right? The Afrofuturist vision, it's not just a kind of mental exercise. I see folks doing it all the time in the grassroots. It's the young people that I think are thinking in bigger ways. They're thinking about a future that doesn't look like a past we've ever had before. So the hope for me lies there, and it also just lies in, Bamidele, like the kind of keeping the resistance alive by committing himself to the accurate record, right? It's a work that doesn't just preserve, right? It brings it into the present and shows us how history is alive and well. It's the work like Zach's, right, of organizing just from the grassroots, the sort of original visions of Black resistance that don't rely on getting people to vote a particular way. It's not all about national electoral politics. It's about creating the communities you want from the ground up. So yes, the hope is always very much alive.
It was actually whether or not I can buy the book today here.
Yes.
But over and beyond, you brought up something else since I raised my hand. Does it make sense? Does it make sense to do the exact same thing and infiltrate the right?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, so, all right, so first of all, we have to think about the logistics on that one. This is like a good exercise, so let's talk through it. Okay, so the logistics on that one, it's gotta be a white person. Are we gonna find somebody we can trust? Okay, and then they infiltrate, but then to what means? Because we know that the power structure, who we are supposedly gonna go to report them, is supporting them. So then who do we go to hold them to account? So I think for me, it's like, we can infiltrate the right. We'll probably learn a couple things we didn't already know. But I do think to some extent, part of it is cutting off the blood flow. That kind of goes into like, right? If we cut off the blood flow, which means the attention that we give them, the legitimation that we give them, I think if we divest from the media that props them up and gives them a platform, and that's gotta be a collective project, because I mean, divesting from media, it's like, well, you have 5 people who stop reading the New York Times, so what does that do? But for me, that could be, I mean, I don't know, I'd be interested, what do you think about infiltrating the right?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that. That's a good question. I think that there are organizations that very much study the right. So I point to like Political Research Associates does really good research on the right to help understand that. But that's not what you're at.
Well, as a last comment on that, I honestly think that the right wing will accept human behavior more realistically than progressive left-thinking people. And I think they take advantage of the way people actually react to information and how they strategize to do it. And so the hesitancy that's being expressed to go and do what they do, I think is an example of it.
Okay. Okay, yes, so that for me is a little bit of a different question. But okay, I don't mind when we have to wrap it. Okay, so like you and me, we can talk some more. But okay, let me just say something about this, because I do think there's always this question of why is the right so successful? We could just kind of look basically like they have a very homogenous base. They're appealing to people that are already very similar. So like that's already pretty easy, because all you have to do is tell one compelling narrative. But if we want to go a little more theoretical, like when you frame, you have to diagnose the problem. You have to have a prognosis, which means that you offer some kind of solution, and then you need to motivate, which means that you have to have an emotional appeal that gets people to show up. So the right is really good at hitting on all 3 of those. But if you think about the left and the fact that we are all very different, coming from different backgrounds, different interests, it's a lot harder to create that one strategic narrative that's going to pull everyone into the fold. So part of it might be learning from the right in terms of having simpler narratives that have more emotional appeals that actually draw people in. But then, I mean, part of it might just be realizing that part of their game is dividing us. And so I think just the recognition that when we're divided, it's not actually because we have like really meaningful internal divisions. It's because they've done a really good job of convincing us that we do.
Historically, there have been a successful incursions into rights to divide them.
Oh, so that's interesting.
There has been some historical precedents for that. But anyway.
Thank you.
No, my training was cognitive psychology, and it just seems to me, but no, it just seems to me that people who approach it from that end just accept that that's the way people do things without the idealism of what we bring.
Right.
Now, do I think it's better? No. But I do just think that there are some realisms that they deal with there. So,
Well, we'll have one final
and the
question.
book.
One final question, and then we'll get to the book signing. But please join me in thanking Zach and thanking Hajar for making this an invigorating discussion, and I appreciate it so very much. And I'm so sorry, and I apologize for the false alarm.
No, no
Yes.
worries.
This is interesting. I didn't really say I wanted it, but I have a question. Plus,
okay, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, but I think you kind of heard me. But what I'm trying to say is that, how big of a part do you believe that the lack of education in the inner cities has played on our oppression?
I always say this, I think formal education is valuable for all sorts of reasons. In the way our society is set up, it's mostly for the credential. So if we want to think more deeply about what type of education actually matters, the type of education that has been withheld, it's the one that empowers those communities, that teaches them their own history and the fact that resistance is in their blood. So yeah, I mean, I always say that I don't think education is the solution, because as we know, so many of the people that are at the helm of all of this, pulling the puppet strings, are incredibly well educated, but the only thing that they're doing is creating this culture of ignorance. So it's much more about the critical education, the one that asks the deeper questions of why we know what we know, and then also in the spirit of Ella Baker, that celebrates the grounded knowledge of the community, that actually believes that people know best about their own experiences, and that helps them organize through that knowledge. So that, to me, is the type of education that we need, and that is very much at the core of making us believe that we are isolated individuals who are not in community with one another. We're alienated and powerless.
Well, thank you so very much. You know, this book, you do want to get this book. And so I'm pleased that you have copies of it here. There is a sociologist, Alden Morris, who has written this commentary, this blurb on the back of the book. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement created a powerful liberation legacy. Today, right-wing and progressive movements fight fiercely over its ownership. Will this legacy be perverted to achieve oppressive ends, or fulfill in quest to achieve equality? And so that's a question. I want to leave that with everyone. We certainly hope that it is the latter, and that we move in that direction continually every day. And I want to thank you for bringing this book into being, and for allowing us to think about some of these, and to think about the not only reclaiming the legacy, but extending the purview of the civil rights initiatives to other sectors of the society as well. Thank you so very much.